Hi, I'm Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get On Board, and this is Women Get On Board in Conversation. Our goal with these video series is to empower our members and to empower women leaders to basically accelerate and help them along in their board journeys. Today, I am pleased to speak to Helen Bobiwash. She's an independent director of Health Sciences North, AFOA Canada, and most recently, Build Ontario Fund. And Helen is here today to talk to us as business leaders on how we can support and move forward on our path to truth and reconciliation. Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Deborah. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective.
So maybe we'll just start off and tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do as an Indigenous business leader, advocating for ways to enhance business and economic connections between corporate Canada and Indigenous communities to build trust and meaningful relations on the pathway to truth and reconciliation.
Thanks, Deborah. So I would first start by letting you know that I am a First Nations woman. I am a member of the Thessalon First Nation in Northern Ontario, and I'm a member of the Bear Clan. And the clan system in the Anishinaabe is based around some of the animals that are in our region. And among the Anishinaabe, the Bear Clan is responsible for the well-being of the community through security as well as the health within the community. And I take that responsibility seriously. And I see my role, whether it's as an accountant who has worked formerly with First Nations or whether now as a board director, is really focused on uplifting the well-being of our communities, Indigenous communities, but also the greater society within Canada and Mother Earth. And I do believe that if Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people can walk beside each other and work together with mutual respect and shared responsibility, we can all thrive. And that's really why I'm here. Been doing this work for going on 30 years now with Indigenous organizations and First Nations, and now within the corporate sector as well. So I'm really happy to be sharing my experience at the board table and really finding out, how can we better as corporate directors support the well-being of our communities and the prosperity of the communities at the same time as we're also striving for that prosperity of the companies.
So maybe what you can help us do, because part of Pathway to Truth and Reconciliation is really becoming more educated as non-Indigenous people, myself included, on trying to understand the calls to action for Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And there's one in particular that's focused on the corporate sector, which is Truth 92, which is about business and reconciliation.
So the TRC call to action number 92 is definitely calling on the corporate sector to take some action. The first one really is about adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework. And that includes consultation, obtaining free, prior, and informed consent before proceeding with development, involving Indigenous peoples and the lands and resources within their traditional territory. And I really feel like when you are delivering a service that still, if it's a service specifically targeted towards Indigenous people, having that engagement with them and really understanding what do they need with a particular service, that's really important. And then when it comes to the lands, that's even more critical because Indigenous people are the traditional stewards of the lands and the waters. There is some legislation that requires engagement and consultation with Indigenous people as rights holders. So that's really important as well when it comes to that, the UNDRIP and the implementation of UNDRIP across Canada, but also how the corporations can use it to their benefit as well. But number 92 also calls for the equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector and long-term sustainable benefits to Indigenous communities from those development projects. And to me, those key terms are equitable and sustainable. That has to be meaningful, and it's opportunities that help to lift up Indigenous people, that it's not tokenism, that there's some real intent to improving the access. And that's all part of your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. But I think it goes more than that. But I think at least building that in and taking the perspective of we want to be inclusive, not just giving somebody a job and saying, okay, we've hired a person. That's our demonstrated equity. And then lastly, with number 92, it also calls for the provision of education to management and staff on the history of Indigenous people, because we found out that particularly when the media reports around the grave sites at residential schools were being released, that people weren't aware that the Indian residential schools occurred in Canada and that some of the abuses occurred there and that there were deaths around those residential schools and the activities there. So education is really important. And I think it's important for the awareness, but also for that meaningful change that's needed within the corporate sector. Because I do ask people, like, why do you want to do reconciliation? What's the big deal? The big deal is in that truth that you need to learn as people living in Canada and corporations that are operating in Canada. And the other thing I just wanted to add just quickly is that there are more than just number 92 call to action. There are many more calls to action that I feel are pertinent to corporations. There are some that are pertinent to education, health, justice, legal, religious organizations, media, sports, and athletics. And corporations can all be delivering services and operating in those sectors. So as board directors, I encourage people to read all the calls to action and reflect on how do those other calls to action also intersect with their corporation.
Wow. I'm pause on that because that was a lot.
It is.
But I think what my takeaway is it has to be meaningful, it has to be equitable, and it has to be sustainable, right? Are there programs out there that you are aware of that, that really you would recommend as, I know sometimes there's subsets within, various governance education programs, but is there something that you would highly recommend as board members, not specific to an industry, but what should board members be thinking about to have a better understanding, to make better decisions?
So our job as directors is, like you mentioned, the fiduciary responsibility. We have a duty of care. We really are responsible for helping guiding the corporation for its long-term sustainability. And I do feel that the long-term sustainability of corporations in Canada is linked to the Indigenous people here. There are numerous opportunities that come with building meaningful and equitable relationships with Indigenous people. This includes access to a workforce, to suppliers, potential business partners. They could be shareholders of the corporation, customers, and even as partners, as suppliers. Indigenous people hold a vast amount of knowledge that can be shared to support the corporate sustainability, particularly when they're operating near Indigenous communities and when they're looking at environmental sustainability. Indigenous people have a lot of knowledge around environmental sustainability. We occupy 80% of the lands by diversity is on land occupied by Indigenous people. So we do hold a lot of knowledge that could be used in a respectful way to support a corporation, but there's also risks to not developing meaningful relationships with Indigenous people. We are rights holders with rights protected under the Constitution, and that's where the free, prior, and informed consent comes in when development and particularly will be impacting their rights, and you're risking litigation potentially, which is costly and time consuming. There's also reputational risks, the risk of blockades to operations. We've seen it in the news, right? And we've seen rail lines being shut down across Canada. So those are real risks that to a corporation that need to be considered. So I believe that a board of directors, from a business perspective, they really do need to identify and to provide direction around, like, let's do an assessment on what are the opportunities and the risks associated with relationships with Indigenous people, and how can we build on the opportunities and mitigate the risks?
There's when you think about your fiduciary duty as a board, there's the, being responsible and having the interests of stakeholders. But I think you've extended that beyond to right holders as well, right? So we have to look beyond just stakeholder and who the best interests of stakeholders, but also who the right holders are, right? And I think that has a different definition and requires a meaningful consultation and understanding.
Can I just add in something there? So when it comes to stakeholders, I would like to change that term, and I know it's it's an overarching term that's used to group a number of different groups, or to categorize a number of different groups for engagement and other purposes. But from an Indigenous perspective, stakeholder is not a very good term.
Well,
so if you look at
enlighten me.
If you look at the historical context of a stakeholder was somebody who went onto lands that was traditionally used by the Indigenous people, and a settler could place a stake in the land, and then that becomes theirs. So Indigenous people were displaced by people staking claims on the land, and the people were displaced by it. They had to be moved to a different location because of these stakeholders. So I guess part of my, journey now is to just share that information, right? That we do need to find a different term when it comes to having conversations with Indigenous people. We can be rights holders. We can also be customers and business partners and shareholders. So my goal is to no longer hear the term stakeholder when we're talking about engagement and other.
Well, duly noted, and I will seek more understanding and education on that, because I do think it is a common used term that is misused in the context. Thank you, Helen. I think we could continue our conversations, but what I really love to do is maybe if there's some key takeaways you'd like our audience to go away with today and where they can learn more about you, if you could share that with us, that would be great.
So there's two key takeaways that I'd like to share. First of all, coming back to the materiality of, what are the risks and opportunities associated with Indigenous relations. I would like to see corporations move Indigenous relations out of the social responsibility role and move it into, it's a matter of good business. It's a matter of risk management and building on opportunities. It's more your business operations, your core competency. It's not just about a social responsibility. It's about a responsibility to the business and the sustainability of the business, as well as just the greater society. And I know that gets more into social responsibility again. And the last takeaway is, I know that the TRC calls to action are foremost in people's mind, but there is another report out there that pertains to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The report was released in 2018 after 2 years of a national inquiry into the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And that report issued calls to justice that are pertinent to human security, to media, to the health sector, transportation sector, hospitality, police services, and similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, like education, health, and childcare. Also, though, to extractive and development corporations. So I do urge people to also look at the report on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the calls to action, and to see, are there ways that as a corporation that we can also address some of these calls to action? As for where you can reach me, I am on LinkedIn, so look for me on LinkedIn. As well, I'm on the Building Opportunities Fund and Health Sciences North Board of Directors. Miigwech.
Well, Helen, that's it for Women Get on Board in Conversation. Thank you. We are so grateful for you joining us. This is just the beginning. You're a huge advocate. I want to continue our conversations. Really appreciate you taking time. To find more resources for your board journey, or to join Women Get on Board, which is now more than 950 members strong, visit womengetonboard.ca.